Right, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Today we are doing a webinar on everything you need to know about your finances in Portugal, whether you are planning on moving to Portugal, or you are one of the lucky ones who are already there. So we'll crack on and get straight into the webinar. Just cover the agenda, what we're planning to cover today. So we will do a brief introduction for those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting us before. We will then cover the non-habitual residency. Some of you will know or heard about it, but it's very important when planning your finances in Portugal. We will then cover UK inheritance tax and mention Portugal succession tax. Then move on to income tax and how you have the options to transfer your UK pensions, how that's involved. We'll cover capital gains tax, and then at the end we have a few frequently asked questions, and we open the floor for a Q&A session. The Zoom session allows you to submit your questions as the webinar continues using the Q&A, so feel free to submit those as we go on, and we will get to those at the end. So, Fiduciary Wealth Management, who we are. So, brief introduction. My name is Matt Penfold, Advisor and Director here at Fiduciary Wealth. I've worked in financial services for 20 years, having spent the last 4 years working here in Gibraltar, but living across the border in Spain, looking after and servicing our clients. With me is our Managing Director and founding partner of Fiduciary Wealth, Correa. For his years of experience in financial services, more than most. Initially working for the Inland Revenue, Paul moved into private banking before founding Fiduciary Wealth in 2007, partnering with Islas 1892, which is the oldest law firm in Gibraltar. About Fiduciary Wealth, aside from our legal roots, we're also a member of MGI Worldwide, a top 20 global network of accountants and tax advisors throughout the globe. And our goal is very simple. We want to positively shape the wealth of the expat community, offering unbiased expert advice that delivers the solutions and outcomes that you will seek. So that is us, and we get straight into the webinar and straight into the non-habitual residency. So we'll cover it briefly. So I should mention actually the agenda we're covering today is slightly different to what we advertised on the email invite. The reason for that is this webinar is about your finances, and we have separate webinars covering things like visas and residency in Portugal. If you're interested in that or any other matters, go to our YouTube channel. The webinars will be up within the next week or so, and we've got some from the past. Feel free to go on there, and we would really appreciate you liking, sharing, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can get all that information from us for free. So we'll cover the NHR and the background of it. I won't cover. Most of you will be familiar. The non-habitual residency scheme at NHR is a 10-year tax scheme available for those relocating to Portugal. The main caveat, there are more, but the main one is that you haven't been tax resident in Portugal in the last 5 years. Now, the point of the NHR scheme is it's a tax-friendly scheme that's designed to attract wealthy foreigners to Portugal and part of all our money. So I'll go through the benefits of NHR, and I'll also kind of mention how it compares to normal Portuguese taxation. NHR lasts for 10 years, as I say, and then after the 10-year period, of course, you remain in Portugal, or you can remain in Portugal, and then normal taxation applies. So pension income under NHR is capped at 10%, but it is possible to take that to low down as 1.5%. We will cover later in the webinar how that is possible. If you've got pension income after NHR, then it's your marginal tax rates, which we will reveal later. Employment income under NHR is a flat rate of 20%. Post NHR is again your marginal tax rates. Foreign source income, 0% tax. as long as this is taxable in the country where that income derives. Now, dividends is a very interesting one and a very big draw to people looking to take advantage of the non-habitual residency scheme. And at this point, I should say that the way NHR works is based on the double taxation agreements between Portugal and your home country or where the income is deriving from. So we use the example of the UK because we mainly deal with Brits. And a quirk of the double taxation agreement and NHR surrounding dividends is that under NHR, they deem the dividends taxable where the income derives. In the UK, the dividends are taxed based on your tax residency, so Portugal. So because of those two factors, it's possible to access your dividends as 0% during the 10-year period of NHR. Post NHR, it's a flat rate of 28%, so there's a huge difference there. Now, the one area that NHR doesn't really cover is capital gains tax, which is a flat rate of 28% NHR or post NHR. So, Paul, we're going to cover that a little bit later in the webinar. So that's the highlights of non-habitual residency. I think I also should say with this webinar that we're here to give you a very clear guide on the finances, but your finances are specific to you, and we can give this information, but it's very important to have a tailored advice specific to your situation. So for those who want that and haven't spoken to us before, please reach out and we can see how we can help you. So we move on to inheritance tax and succession tax. That slide is a bit misleading for Portuguese succession tax because there really isn't any. But yeah, if you can tell us about both and what's important to consider, please.
Yeah, well, Portuguese succession tax is based on the principle of tax residency, whereas UK inheritance tax is based on domicile. So it happens when there's an interaction between the UK and a third country based on Napoleonic laws that potentially you're caught between two jurisdictions and be taxable in both. But as you quite rightly say, that the good news is that there's no inheritance tax to pay in Portugal if the assets are being passed on between spouses and direct descendants, meaning children and grandchildren, and equally, if the children were to pass their estate to ascendants, back to the parents, because they predeceased their parents. The bad news, unfortunately, is that you're still likely to remain UK domiciled for UK IHT purposes. And as I said earlier, the UK inheritance tax is based on the concept of domicile of origin. This is something you acquire at birth, where you're born, or where your father is born. So in theory, you can claim and acquire a domicile of choice if you settle in another country with intention to remain there permanently. Equally, after 5 years of non-UK tax residency, again, in theory, you could claim a domicile of choice, but that's easier said than done. So it is fraught with difficulty. There's no fixed rules, and the burden of proof always lies on the individual to prove that they have in fact acquired a domicile of choice. But in any event, even if someone were to be successful, I've yet to find anyone that has, I have to admit, in my experience, but even if they were to do that, it's not uncommon for a Brit to return back to the UK temporarily, perhaps due to ill health, because they feel more confident going back to, and seeing a medical practitioner back in their home country, or perhaps even permanently, because one of the spouses passes away and they haven't got a social network around them and they feel obliged to go back. So whether it's permanently or temporarily for 1 year, you might trigger again your domicile of choice becoming reverting back to your domicile of origin. So you get caught up very, very quickly. It only takes is one tax year. As I said, after 5 years, yes, you can shed off your domicile, but it's really complicated because ties such as business interests, social and family connections, if you have property back in the UK, or even something which I'll cover on in greater detail in a minute, something called intentions, is just enough to be considered UK domicile for IHT. I mean, HMRC will look at the detail. But yes, even insignificant ties get challenged. And we know that HMRC can easily rely on the most tenuous of grounds to dismiss a claim that someone has legitimately chosen a domicile of choice. They've gone to Portugal and a non-habitual resident, spent there 10 years, and they genuinely want to stay there permanently. But it is not that easy. I'll give you one example, Matt.
Okay.
The most high-profile case is the Welsh actor, now deceased, Richard Burton. He left the UK for the US in 1957. In fact, he moved to the US some years earlier than 1957, and then moved to Switzerland in 1957. He passed away in 1984, having spent more than 30 years outside the UK. And one would have thought that that was enough to avoid UK IHT. No. The UK tax authorities made an inheritance tax claim on his estate on the grounds that he never actually relinquished his UK domicile. And the claim was successful purely or merely because he bought a burial plot in Wales, so he retained the emotional ties with the mother country, and his intention, again, the word I used earlier, his intention was always to return to the UK. And the basis for the claim, Matt, was that he was buried in the colours of the Red Dragon, in Welsh colours, holding a poem book of Dylan Thomas. So on those grounds, they claimed. So his worldwide estate of 5 million ended up being taxed and receiving a tax bill, or his heirs, of 2.4 million. So 2.4 million in 1984 was a fair bit of money, yeah? So, but there's always, every cloud has a silver lining, and the good news is if you are non-UK tax resident, if you do your tax planning early and you do it properly, then it's possible to restructure your tax and financial affairs in such a way that you either mitigate or eradicate completely any exposure to UK inheritance tax. But you can be penny wise, pound foolish. Thinking you can do it on your own, not thinking it through, and not structuring correctly, and then ending up messing it even more than it was initially. So it's important that you get good quality advice, and that things are thought through, and the plan is put in place to ensure that we can mitigate that liability to its absolute minimum. Perhaps even there would be no liability. And as you know, Matt, this is an area that we specialize in.
No, absolutely. And I think from my experience, inheritance tax for expats is something that's really not considered when it is so important. But we think, okay, the UK is behind us, but if only it was that simple, Paul, and we've seen some disasters, and then that's why we want to help people mitigate that. So, yeah, so the key takeaways, no Portuguese succession tax. There is imposto de selo, which is like a stamp duty, but direct family members, no problem. But inheritance tax UK is a problem with a solution. Let's call it that.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. So we're talking about your finances in Portugal. So income tax, these are for the last year income tax rate. So it's to give you a guide more than anything. And bear in mind what I said earlier, this is post NHR over those people, and we've seen it recently. And for those who haven't relocated, another reason to plan in advance. Paul and I recently in Portugal, we met a couple of individuals. They're already living in Portugal, and we said, oh, you're using the NHR? And they said, no, I left it too late, which is madness to us because the NHR scheme is so valuable but the timings are very precise and that's where you need to really plan in advance.
I was actually quite surprised, Matt, because I thought that would have been an outlier. But then in a short trip, we found out that there were not one or two, but there were quite a few that had come, with no idea what they were doing, established a tax residency completely unaware of NHR, or aware of NHR, but not knowing the procedure and thinking they could do it on their own, only to find that they've been, that they didn't meet the cut-off date of 31st of March of the following year, right?
Exactly. You miss that date, you miss a vote, and you missed your chance. So here's income tax for post-NHR for those people who didn't succeed under the scheme. Like the UK, there is a small personal allowance, but it's much lower. It's around €4,000. Outside of NHR, your worldwide tax contributes to it. So your pension income, employment income. If you have rental income in the UK, you still pay tax in the UK, but it's added and you receive a credit towards your tax bill. So we mentioned earlier about the pension income, 10% could be lowered to 1.5%. This works post NHR. It's not as low as 1.5%. People can lower it to single figures, which leads me nicely on to the next detail, which is transferring your UK pensions. So many of you would have built up your UK pensions throughout your career, worked very hard for those, but here you have an opportunity to make a sizable tax saving. So an option you do have is to be able to transfer your UK pensions to a QROS, a qualifying recognised overseas pension scheme. We'd recommend use of one in Malta because of the double taxation agreement in Portugal. And there's many reasons to use a QROS. One of those is for those who are close to their lifetime allowance. So for those who aren't aware of that, at some point your pensions there will be what they call a benefit crystallisation event applied. And this is where the total value of your pensions is compared to the lifetime allowance, which says there currently 1,073,000. I think it's 1,073,100 to be precise. And if your total pensions is above that limit, then you will pay a tax penalty of 25% on income or 55% on lump sums. Now, these benefit crystallisation events happen at different periods, normally when you start accessing your pensions. But for those close to the limit, or even those who are already over the limit actually, if you transfer your UK pension to a QROS, the benefit crystallisation event happens upon transfer. So if you are under the limit and your pension grows after that, there's no tax. So the event happens and then they base the lifetime allowance charge on your pension at that point. So to give another example, if you're already over that limit, you've got say 1.2 million, then you will pay tax on the excess of that amount. So we're talking 127,000. But your pension continues to grow after that, and any growth, there's not a further tax applied for that. So anyone even approaching that limit or above, I would urge you to have a conversation with us about that because that should be a no-brainer. Now, on the income tax, because of the way the QROS is set up, you are able to structure income payments using something called a temporary annuity, not an annuity that you buy that we're used to in the UK. And the way this works is because they cannot identify which part of the pension is growth and which is return of capital or funding, that only 15% of those income payments, this only applies to QROS, it doesn't apply to your UK pensions. Only 15% of that is taxable. The tax rate under NHR is 10%, so it's an effective tax rate of just 1.5%. Post NHR, it still works. Only 15% of the income is taxed. It's just then taxed at your marginal tax rate, but you are still paying income tax on that of single digits, between about 4% and 7%. So an incredible saving. And the final one on there is, as you may know, UK pensions, if an individual dies age 75 or over, if they die under 75, there's no tax liability for their beneficiaries. 75 and over, then your beneficiaries will have to pay tax at your marginal tax rate. The QOPs, this differs. You can pass on the pension to your heirs, and they can continue withdrawing the tax at the original, the same beneficial tax rate, depending on their individual circumstances.
That's a very good point, Matt, because you know the way it's sold in the UK, that even after age 75, you know, the beneficiaries, you know, it's kind of, you hear people say, my UK pension is doesn't form part of my estate for UK IHT, which is correct.
Yeah.
But it's not that you avoid taxation completely. All it does is that if you die after the age of 75, your beneficiaries will pay tax at the marginal rate on any income that they draw from the structure, and they keep it in.
Exactly, yeah. To access that money, they have to pay the tax. So there's no inheritance tax, but it's rebadged with a different tax.
Exactly. So yeah, it's been branded very attractively.
Yeah.
As no IHT, but there's taxation to pay notwithstanding. And if the beneficiaries are higher rate taxpayers, then they could potentially be on the 40 or the 40 rate band as well, no?
Yeah.
Or higher.
The 45 now, now it's back.
Now it's back. Exactly.
But no, it's interesting, and what I've never really considered before is that cut-off line, that 75 years of age, that's been in place for a long time. And there's never any talk of it increasing, despite the fact that everyone tends to have higher pensions, we're all living longer as well, and the chances are you will last longer than 75.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's an interesting one. That
I hope so, because I'm very close.
Yeah, you've got 1 year to go, Paul. Yeah?
Exactly.
So moving on nicely from that, we also have a QNOPS. So this is similar to a QOPS, but not the same. A QOPS is funded from a transfer of your UK pension. A QNOPS is funded through a lump sum investment. So why would you use a QOPS, people ask? Well, there's a lot of good reasons for that. A lot of the features of the QOPS, the same apply. So there's no capital gains because it's a pension, same with QOPS. The the income can be structured in exactly the same way. So 1.5% under NHR, but 4 to 7% outside. And the same all applies that we were talking about there at age 75 compared to the UK pension. But a big use of attraction of the QNOPS is that if you place funds within a QNOPS, then that money is immediately outside of your estate for UK inheritance tax. So Paul spoke about UK inheritance tax, so we're still exposed to that. But a QNOPS is a very good solution to that. Now, there are caveats with that. So we see the final line there, the QNOPS must be set up as a genuine retirement vehicle because it is a pension. So it has to be in line with your wealth, age, and future income requirements. So what we mean by that is that if you want to take advantage of this opportunity as an expat, because it is an opportunity, you need to make sure you do that sooner rather than later. Because I'll give an example. You've got somebody they're 75, they've got wealth of 5 million. They say, right, I want to put 3 or 4 million in a QNOPS. HMRC will rightly say that is an IHT fudge, and therefore it remains in your estate for inheritance tax purposes. That's not a genuine pension. But the younger you are, the more you're able to fund that QNOPS. So again, we mention this a lot, but it's true. The earlier you plan, the better. Not just so you have peace of mind, not just that everything's structured properly, but also there are opportunities that you will lose as time passes.
Can I just mention something briefly on QNOPS? I think there's 3 clear advantages. One, once inside the pension trust structure, it grows free of capital gains tax. And you know, capital gains tax is quite steep.
28%.
28%. So it's rolling over gross without any capital gains. I think it's a huge advantage.
Yeah.
So that's one. Second, you mentioned the low tax on pension income.
Yeah.
And the third, as you rightly say, is that the initial contribution, as well as any growth in the pension fund, is passed on to your heirs free of UK IHT.
Yeah.
And there's no inheritance tax in Portugal either.
Exactly.
So if that is not a huge plus, I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And it happens the minute that you fund the QNAPs, which is unbelievable. There's no rules, there's no conditions attached. Immediately removed.
Even if you return back to the UK.
Even if you return back to UK.
And there is another use for QNOPs, which I'll get to a little bit later, that links into capital gains.
But Matt, just a quick thing on UK pension transfers.
Yeah, please.
Because I think it's a relevant issue.
Yeah.
As you know, there's new UK pension transfer regulations, which were introduced in November 2021. It's the UK Pension Schemes Act 2021, and it enables UK pension scheme seeding scheme trustees to refuse a UK pension transfer on the grounds that there's an increased risk of pension scamming. And of course, that very often is just an excuse to delay the transfer. But it is becoming much more difficult to get a UK pension transferred to a suitable overseas pension arrangement to structure the affairs more tax efficiently. Now, the processing times as a result of this new UK legislation are getting longer and longer. There's more due diligence to satisfy. And even though it's supposed to prevent pension scamming, it's actually really the UK pension industry lobbying the UK government because they're losing a lot of pension assets overseas. But it's becoming a hindrance, and there's talk that the UK government may revisit the Act with a view to maybe tinkering the edges, because it's not supposed to prevent the UK pension transfer, but you know that is an issue. And the second thing I'd like to mention is defined benefit schemes. If you have a final salary scheme, again, not the UK government or HMRC, but the regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, has issued some strict guidelines on when a defined benefit transfer can be, the conditions to be able to transfer your UK final salary scheme to a QROS. And it's becoming tougher to fulfill all the conditions, and it's taking longer as well. So I think it's worth mentioning that there's still an opportunity to transfer your defined benefit scheme, but it's a long, arduous process with no guarantees at the end, and ultimately, it falls back on the client whether they want to insist that they want to go through the transfer. Clearly, there's pros and cons.
Of course, yeah.
And just one final point on UK pensions, but I think is highly relevant to the attendees today. The overseas transfer charge of 25%, which I think HMRC introduced in 2017.
Correct.
And they introduced, so essentially what they said was, if you transfer your UK pension benefit to a country outside the EEA, which is all the EU countries, with Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Gibraltar, and Norway. Yeah. So if you transfer your pension within the EEA, no overseas transfer charge. If you transfer it outside, unless the trustee is in the same country as the member of the scheme in terms of tax residency, then you pay 25%. And of course, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have a client in the US and you're going to have pension trustees in the US, because QROPS is really, you don't find them in every single jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So the UK government in 2017 was conditioned and unable to apply across the globe, because they were part of the EU at the time, and there's the 4 freedoms. One of the freedoms is the free movement of capital. Had they applied the OTC charge to UK pension transfers to the EEA, they would have been in breach of one of the 4 freedoms. So whilst they haven't done anything yet, if things get, if the relationship between the UK and the EU deteriorates further, and under Boris Johnson and these things were uncomfortable, then the UK government in retaliation may well decide to extend that OTC charge to the EEA, in which case it makes it uneconomical to transfer a UK pension. So if anyone is considering what to do with the UK pensions, then they should seriously consider moving quickly rather than delaying, because things are changing all the time. The pandemic, they're looking for more revenue, and they're tightening the noose around UK pensions.
No, absolutely. It seems that the door has slowly been edging, and will they close it? We can't say yes, we can't say no, but it could happen. And it's obvious why they would do that. The UK pension industry is they don't want to see their outflows, and HMRC, they want the tax revenue. They're given tax relief on the pensions, and then somebody transfers it out, they're losing out on that. So there is an opportunity, great, but yeah, will that always be there? I'm not sure. So we move on to capital gains tax, which I will try and cover very briefly. We covered the capital gains tax rate quite clearly. It's 28%. NHR doesn't add any benefit to this. So an important one to add here, which a lot of people aren't aware of, is in Portugal there's capital gains tax on the sale of your property. Now this doesn't apply if you reinvest that in another property, not a problem. But for those who want to sell their property and maybe move into rental property, for those who are downsizing, then it creates a possible capital gains. So how can they mitigate that? So there are 2 ways. If you sell your house and you reinvest it in a property, then there's no capital gains. Or if you sell the house and you reinvest it in a qualifying investment, then there's no capital gains. Now, a QNOPS applies as one of those qualifying investments, as does a Portuguese compliant bond, which I will cover very briefly now. So you can also use a combination of the 2. So that's when people are downsizing. You're selling your house, you're buying a smaller property, and if you invest the remaining in the Portuguese bond or the QNOPS, then there's no capital gains liability.
So effectively, you have to invest in either or both the full amount. So if you sell a property for $1 million,
Yeah.
and you downsize to a property of 500,000,
Yeah.
and the balance of 500,000 you invest in a qualifying investment,
Yeah.
then there's no CGT of 28%.
Exactly.
That's
Whereas, say if it's using your example, Paul, you sell your house of $1 million, you buy one for $500,000, you don't do anything with that other $500,000, then the growth element of that, the 28% capital gains tax is applied.
So it's an incentive to invest again in the country.
Exactly. So so the Portuguese compliant bond, we mentioned that is one reason you might want to use it. But the main reason is it's a wrapper that is the most really tax efficient option you have in Portugal. So in the UK, we have things like the ISAs and maybe tax deferral bonds. As soon as you exit the UK, those tax wrappers don't apply anymore. So if you have ISAs in the UK, you would have to pay tax again. You keep going back to the 28% in Portugal on any growth on that and possible other tax on those. So you have the Portuguese compliant bond, which is a wrapper around investment. So it's a life insurance contract that's funded by a lump sum investment. No immediate capital gains, so it can continue to grow and grow with no capital gains. And you only pay tax when you make a withdrawal. So you make a withdrawal, a surrender, and then only the gain element of it is taxed. Now, that tax is 28% in Portugal, we know that, but one of the great benefits of the Portuguese compliant bond is the longer you hold that money in the bond, the lower the tax rate is applied. So if you get as far as 8 years, then the tax rate goes down to 11.2%. So given a bit of an example there, a very simple one, someone invests 100k, it makes 50k, they come to surrender amounts of 15k, so only 5% of that is gain, so only that element is taxable, 11.2% tax, so there's only 560 euros to pay in tax. Works out as an effective rate of 3.73. The tax is withheld, paid straight to the authorities, so from an admin point of view. So the bonds, Portuguese compliant bond, very efficient, is not for those who want to invest and take their money back in a year. Ideally, for those who are looking to keep the money in them for 8 years, I would say maybe a minimum of 5 years really on that one. So that comes towards the end. We want to just cover a few questions. I think
you want to ask me something on capital gains on this one?
Of course, thank you, Paul. Yeah, see, I called you old earlier, Paul, but my memory is the one that's going, so here you go. Yeah, capital gains tax, we covered this one a bit in the sense of 28% is a high rate. So, Paul, what if somebody's got a very large capital gain? Maybe they've had a large share portfolio in the UK, or they have business interests, which they're going to create a large capital gain. Are they just stuck to paying the 28%? Is there any solutions we can offer those people?
Well, wonderful as the non-habitual residency regime is, if there's one major flaw, is that there's no distinction made between the capital gains tax rate of 28% and the normal Portuguese tax residency and non-habitual residency. So non-habitual residency doesn't shield you or reduce your tax liability to capital gains. So let's give you some practical examples. Let's say that we have an individual who sold his UK business interests, or an individual who has bought private equity investments for 1 million and it's increased to 5 million.
Okay.
Massive CGT tax liability, yeah? What do you do then? Because there's no protection in terms of non-habitual residency. There is protection for property with downsides, as you explained, but not for this specific situation. What do you do then? I mean, you've got very little choice, right? The beauty about non-habitual residency is you've got 10 years, right?
Yeah.
You can postpone your non-habitual residency for a year or two, establish tax residency in a third country, and then come back. It means that you forfeit of the 10 years, you might forfeit a year or two.
Right, okay.
But that is maybe the price to pay. So give you an example where you could be really, really smart and reduce that tax liability, which could be used. Let's say the tax liability on 5 million CGT, 28%, let's call it 30, is roughly 1.5, yeah? So suddenly you're facing a liability of 1.5 million in Portugal. Then what you do is, let's assume, as an example, 2022. You get to the end of 2022, you exit Portugal and you notify the authorities that for the next year or two, you're exiting Portugal. And then in 2023, you move to a jurisdiction with no capital gains. And for the purposes of this example, because we're keeping it within the Iberian Peninsula, you decide to go to Gibraltar and establish tax residency there for a period of time. You then establish your tax residency, you've exited properly in Portugal, you establish your tax residency in Gibraltar, you dispose of your shares or your business interests in the UK whilst tax resident in Gibraltar, which carries zero capital gains, and you do it properly and legitimately. And then you then return to Portugal in whenever it is, yeah? Maybe 2024, or maybe you have to stay a bit longer in Gibraltar, whether it's a year or 18 months. Remember that the tax years do not run concurrently. So whereas Portugal is a calendar year, UK is April to April, Gibraltar is 1st of July to 30th of June. So it's a question of, you could potentially come to Gibraltar in 1st of January 2023, dispose of your shares, no CGT, return to Portugal on, I'm trying to think, on the 15th of June 2024,
Yeah.
which means you will do in 2024, you are fulfilling the 183-day rule. Yeah. But you stay in Gibraltar for what is effectively 1 or 2 tax years. And you sold off your shares, you go back, you resume your non-habitual residency, and you've avoided a massive tax liability.
Yeah.
So this is where it pays off to get good advice if you've got a dilemma of that sort, without a massive CGT tax liability, and rather than hold up your hands and say, you know what, I'd rather pay. If you are nimble and you're flexible and you're prepared to endure a bit of change, because remember, you can become tax resident in Gibraltar, but still keep your house in Portugal, so long as you stay below the 183-day threshold.
Yeah.
So it's not as if you can't travel to Portugal for a year. No, you just have to reduce your stay for a year. You know, you can go back to the UK, spend 100 days in Gibraltar, which is the bare minimum, and jot down, we've sorted out that problem, and you save yourself a lot of money.
I mean, you make that sound quite simple, Paul, but I don't think it's that simple. There's a lot of kind of moving parts, especially with the different tax years. But for somebody in that situation, I mean, the savings can be incredible. So we couldn't repeat the same thing. You plan that properly, you work with the right people who know what they're doing, and wow, what a saving. So yeah, thank you for that, Paul. That's great. So we'll move on to the questions to finish us off. You've got a couple of very quick questions.
Yeah, well, very quick questions. Can someone get NHR but not live in Portugal full time?
Okay, that's a good question. Always kind of links into what you said there, which is, I promise to everyone, it is accidental. But we do have this question. Sometimes people have see the attraction of NHR, and for some odd reason they don't want to spend too much time in Portugal, which doesn't make sense to me as it's such a beautiful country. But the fact is, to benefit from the NHR, you have to be a tax resident in Portugal. It's as simple as that. So you have to spend a minimum of 183 days, and then you can benefit from that. If you want to live somewhere else and use Portuguese NHR as some kind of tax haven or something, it doesn't work. You have to be a tax resident in Portugal.
Yeah. My second question, what happens with someone's UK state pension when they move to Portugal?
Okay.
What is the position with regards to taxation?
Well, that's a good one, because you can continue to receive your UK state pension. It's still index linked with a triple lock. It's sensible to make sure you exit the UK properly, which again is part of the planning, and enable your UK state pension to be paid gross, and then you can have it taxed in Portugal. So if you're under NHR, again, it can be taxed under the 10%. You can't get a 1.5% like we can do for the QOPs, but it's still better than you would face in the UK.
Good. And my last question, Matt, and I promise this is my last question. Can you keep your UK ISAs when you move to Portugal? And do they continue to be tax efficient?
Okay, good one. And again, I think we covered this a bit briefly, but no, the ISAs do not work. Not just for Portugal, you exit the UK and the tax wrapper that the ISAs have effectively disappears. You might log into your account and it says ISA, but you will be charged tax on that by the authorities where you're tax resident. Okay, thank you, Paul. I've got one question in response, if you allow me.
Yeah.
And it's just a general question, but I think it's the most important one. For those who are evaluating their finances in Portugal and looking to move, what's the one key bit of advice you would give to these people?
Matt, from past experience, we are relocation experts. You know, it's a bumpy road, so you need a trusted advisor by your side that can hold your hand through the journey, making sure it's smooth and seamless transition to your new country of residence. Failing to plan is really planning to fail. As I said earlier, you can be penny wise, pound foolish. You really need to pay for the advice to make sure it's done properly. So you need a timeline, you need a strategy, you need an advisor that can help you execute it. And you need to make sure that you follow the steps in the right order and that you do not miss key steps and then make a very costly mistake. You know, again, trying to be smart, you Google, you find out I can do this and that, and then you really snookered yourself and you're checkmate, right? You've really made a really bad, costly mistake. So my advice is to plan first and move later. And planning begins right before you exit, as we always say. And I think in matters of moving tax residency, it's okay to be the tortoise. You don't need to be the hare. This is not a race. It needs to be done properly. And for me, the most important thing, Matt, is always go back to your exposure to UK inheritance tax. And I think when it comes to UK IHT, it's always advisable to plan for the worst, assume you're liable, and then hope for the best. It's as simple as that. So that a negative posthumous decision by HMRC does not reduce the inheritance of your heirs, your children, because that would be disastrous, right? You've worked hard all your life, your intention is to pass it on to your children, to enjoy it during your lifetime, but then pass it on to your children, and then you made one critical mistake. So yeah, always, first thing you do, look at your estate and calculate what your potential IHT liability is, and work your way thinking, okay, how do I reduce that liability? And there's different ways of doing it from day one when you're doing the planning. It's one of the areas we need to look.
Perfect, absolutely, lovely. So yeah, we have a few questions waiting from us. I think this one is from before we started, said we are not muted. So apologies to anyone who had to listen to any non-webinar content there. So we've got a few questions from, sorry, I can't see the name, BV there. There's a lot of questions on there. And yeah, I think there's too much content. There's 5 lengthy questions there. It kind of goes back to what we're saying here as well. You know, if somebody wants kind of specific information, we're more than happy to have conversations with people. And this is, yeah, this is why people have to have tailored information. You can't learn everything from Google. As amazing as we think our webinar is, there's still going to be kind of gaps specific to your situation.
And the other thing to bear in mind, Matt, is that we specialize in Brits.
Yes.
You know, we don't specialize in the US.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah. So we've got a question from David there. What is Portugal IHT? I think we probably covered that after that question, David, but there is no succession tax in Portugal. There is imposto de selo, which is a stamp duty, which is 10%, but that doesn't apply if your beneficiaries are direct family members, which Paul covered. But key, you know, we repeat it, but we repeat it for a reason. You will be exposed or potentially exposed to UK IHT because of your domicile. So is QNOPS an option for a non-UK citizen resident interested in residing in Portugal as well? That is an option, yeah.
Well, the first thing is, what's the nationality of the individual?
Yeah.
I think that should be the first point.
Yeah.
Because that's what the trustees will look at.
Okay.
I mean, there's no, if you're non-UK resident, then there's no IHT benefit, but there could be other benefits. But again, for BV, in answer to BV, we need to establish what BV's tax residency is. So if he gets in touch with us afterwards, we can look into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got a lot of questions and they're very valid questions. So we can look into that for you. A question from R. Fox there. And what are the platform charges on a tax efficient Portuguese compliant body? It's a very specific question, that one.
Yeah.
I find it a bit odd. Anyone that I have to say we're a regulated entity, we're very upfront with our fees compared to maybe some firms out there, but today is not the place to be going through kind of fees and charges. We will speak to people on an individual basis.
Yeah, we can speak to RF whenever he wants, yeah? He just needs to get in touch with us drop us an email and then we can talk, yeah?
Yeah, and look, our contact details are there at the end of the webinar for anyone who wants to make contact, make good use of those. So from David, can a pension be moved now to a QOPS in Malta but before residency? Or
To stick with the spirit of the rules, if you transfer your UK pension, accrued UK pension benefits to QOPS before leaving, you're entitled to do so. That's not a problem, provided you leave the UK within 12 months of doing so. And we normally, best practice is that we get a disclaimer from the client if they haven't moved yet, acknowledging that the intention is to move to a third country, because that's really important for the purposes of not just NHR, but we will be in breach of UK pension law if the individual then stays in the UK.
Exactly.
So in answer to DC's question is absolutely it can be done, provided it's done within a time frame of 12 months and provided a disclaimer is signed.
Very good. And the next 3 questions come from an anonymous attendee, and we have a rule with this board, don't we? That we're happy to, as you can see, we're happy to answer any questions, but we're a very transparent company, and we expect that from people we're dealing with. So we're always a bit cynical with these anonymous questions. Whoever that is, maybe you're showing anonymous on Zoom by accident. I don't know how that quite works. If that's the case, reach out to us directly, introduce yourself, which is important. We can have a conversation. So we've got a couple of questions at the end from Neil. So does citizenship have any difference as opposed to residency when taking a year's break from the NHR? So that's an interesting question. So I cover it very briefly, but it's probably more a different topic. But for Brits now looking to get residency, for the first 5 years you get what they call temporary residency, and then after 5 years then you can apply for permanent residency and possibly your citizenship, depending on your route. With regards to taking a year's break from the NHR, it doesn't really make any difference. I think the only thing to consider is if you've got temporary residency, then you might have to go through that application process again, whereas if you've got permanent residency, then it's easier to come back and forth to do that.
I think the second question is better to be done directly with me, yeah?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, but it's very specific.
It's very specific.
I don't think we've got enough information there, Neil, to answer that properly, but I think it's something we can help you with. So Neil, please give us a call, send us an email, and we can give you a call in return. So wonderful. I mean, thank you so much for the questions. It's nice that so many people engaged, and thank you for attending this webinar. I reiterate what I said at the start. We're running quite a few webinars, and we like to share a lot of information. So please go to our YouTube channel. We'll be uploading all the recent webinars. We've done 5 or 6 recently. They should be on there within around a week or so, and there will be more coming. So in preparation for those webinars, why don't you subscribe to our YouTube channel? We would really appreciate it if you could like and share those, and we will reach out to you with more content, and we're very grateful. Thank you, Paul, and yeah, we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.